What if I told you there's a country that was born in the middle of a war that lost millions of lives before it even had a chance to begin? That was called a basket case by one of the most powerful men in the world, Henry Kissinger, back in 1971. And yet, 55 years later, that same country is one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. This is not a feel-good myth. This is not Western media's version of a poverty story. This is Bangladesh, a nation of 170 million people, a country the size of Iowa, but with more people than Russia. And this is a story most Americans have never heard, but absolutely need to. Let's go back to 1971. The people of East Pakistan, of what would become Bangladesh, had just won a democratic election. They had a clear majority, a clear mandate. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won over 160 out of 162 seats in the Eastern Wing. It was one of the most decisive election results in South Asian history, but the military government of West Pakistan, led by General Yahya Khan, refused to accept it. They refused to hand over power. They refused to respect the democratic will of millions of people. And when the people protested, the military responded with violence. What followed was one of the most brutal crackdowns of the 20th century. On the night of March 25th, 1971, a night history calls Operation Searchlight, soldiers opened fire on sleeping civilians in Dhaka. Universities were targeted. Intellectuals were hunted. Villages were burned to the ground. Historians estimate between 300,000 to 3 million people were killed in just 9 months. Around 10 million refugees flooded into India. Rape was used as a systematic weapon of war. Families were torn apart. Cities collapsed. The world watched and mostly looked away. America, under Nixon and Kissinger, actually supported the Pakistani military, a decision that remains one of the darkest chapters in U.S. foreign policy. And on December 16th, 1971, after 9 months of brutal liberation war and a decisive Indian military intervention, Bangladesh was finally born. But here's the brutal truth about that moment. Independence is not the same as stability. The country had almost no functioning infrastructure, no financial reserves, no functioning central bank. Farmland was destroyed, factories were looted, millions were homeless and starving. Famine was not a possibility. It was already arriving. Even some of Bangladesh's supposed allies privately doubted it would survive its first decade. Henry Kissinger famously called it a basket case. The world expected it to fail, but it didn't. The 1970s were defined by one word: crisis. A devastating famine in 1974 killed hundreds of thousands of people, made worse by poor government response and international politics. Political instability shook the country from the inside. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founding father of the nation, was assassinated along with most of his family in a military coup in 1975. Only 2 of his daughters survived because they were abroad. One of them, Sheikh Hasina, would return decades later to lead the country herself. Military governments took over. Coups followed coups. The democratic dream that Bangladesh was born with seemed like it might never arrive. And yet, ordinary people kept going, not because someone told them to, not because the government had a plan, but because survival was the only option they had. Farmers replanted fields that had been soaked in blood. Teachers reopened schools and buildings with broken walls. Women carried water for miles to feed their children. Families rebuilt homes from mud and bamboo. Whatever was left, this wasn't inspiring in a cinematic way. There were no dramatic speeches, no Hollywood moments. It was quiet, exhausting, relentless survival, day after day, year after year. Then something unexpected happened in the 1980s that would change everything. A small garment industry, almost an accident of history, began to grow. A Bangladeshi entrepreneur named Nurul Quadr Khan made a deal with Daewoo of South Korea to train 130 Bangladeshi workers. Those workers came back and started their own factories. Western brands were desperately looking for cheaper manufacturing alternatives to South Korea and Taiwan, whose labor costs were rising. Bangladesh had rock-bottom costs, a large and hungry workforce, and a geographic advantage. Factory by factory, the industry started to expand. And here's the part that most Western headlines never mention. The majority of those factory workers were women in a deeply conservative society where women had extremely limited economic roles. The garment industry literally pulled millions of them out of the home and into the formal workforce for the very first time. That shift didn't just change their income, it changed their sense of identity. It changed the way they raised their daughters. It changed marriage patterns, birth rates, and education levels across entire communities. It was a social revolution disguised as a manufacturing sector. It wasn't perfect. Not even close. The conditions were often dangerous. The hours were brutal. 12, 14 hours a day. The pay was barely enough to survive on, and the world would later be forced to confront the human cost of cheap fashion when the Rana Plaza building collapsed in 2013, killing over 1,100 workers. The deadliest garment industry disaster in history. That tragedy forced global brands and governments to take worker safety seriously in a way they never had before. But even through that darkness, progress was happening. Real, measurable, life-changing progress. By the 1990s, Bangladesh was slowly finding its rhythm. Democracy returned in 1991. Fragile, contested, sometimes chaotic, but real. Two women, Sheikh Hasina and Khaleda Zia, took turns leading the country for decades, making Bangladesh one of the rare nations in the world where women dominated the highest levels of political power, even as gender inequality remained a serious problem in everyday life. The economy was growing. Slowly but consistently, and something remarkable was happening outside of government entirely. NGOs founded in Bangladesh were pioneering poverty reduction models that the entire world would later study and copy. Let's talk about BRAC, because every American should know this name. BRAC was founded in 1972 by Sir Fazla Hassan Abed, a Bangladeshi accountant who gave up his corporate career to help rebuild his country after the war. It started as a tiny relief organization distributing aid in one district, but Abed realized that aid alone doesn't change lives. Systems do, so BRAC built systems. It ran its own schools when the government couldn't. It trained healthcare workers called Shastya Shebikas, village women who went door to door delivering basic medical care to millions of people who had never seen a doctor. It created microfinance programs that gave tiny loans to women with no collateral, no credit history, and no access to banks. By the 2000s, BRAC had become the largest NGO on the entire planet. Not a Western charity operating in Bangladesh, but a Bangladeshi organization operating in 11 countries across Asia and Africa. This is the part that gets me every time. A country that the world gave up on, that built the world's greatest poverty-fighting organization from within, with its own people. Meanwhile, nature kept testing Bangladesh's limits. The 1991 cyclone killed 138,000 people in a single night. Floods in 1998 submerged 2/3 of the entire country underwater for over 2 months. 30 million people were displaced. Cyclone Sader in 2007, Cyclone Ayla in 2009. The disasters kept coming, one after another. Climate scientists today call Bangladesh ground zero for climate change. Rising sea levels threaten to swallow 17% of the country's land within decades, potentially displacing 20 million people. And yet, every single time, the country rebuilt. Early warning systems improved. Cyclone shelters were built. Communities organized. International experts who once came to Bangladesh to deliver aid started coming to learn from Bangladesh's disaster response instead. Not because it was easy, but because Bangladeshis had learned through generations of loss that waiting for someone else to save you is not a strategy. The 2000s brought something that changed everything. Technology. Mobile phones spread across the country faster than roads or electricity. A program called Mobile Lady, where rural women became walking phone shops, charging neighbors to make calls. Became a global case study in grassroots innovation. Microfinance, pioneered by Muhammad Yunus and his Grameen Bank, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006, put financial tools in the hands of the poorest women in the world for the first time. Literacy rates climbed steadily. Child mortality dropped faster than almost anywhere else in the developing world. A public health miracle that researchers are still trying to fully explain. By the 2000s, Bangladesh wasn't just surviving anymore. It was genuinely growing. GDP expanded at 6 to 7% annually, year after year, through global recessions and political turmoil. One of the most consistent economic growth records in all of Asia. Mega infrastructure projects began reshaping what was possible. The Padma Bridge, a 6-kilometer crossing over one of the world's most powerful rivers, became a symbol of something deeper than engineering. When the World Bank pulled its funding over corruption allegations in 2012, the government made a decision that shocked everyone. We'll build it ourselves. And they did. When the Padma Bridge opened in June 2022, millions of Bangladeshis wept. Not just because of the bridge, but because of what it meant. That they didn't need anyone's permission to build their future. The garment industry, meanwhile, had grown into the second largest in the entire world, behind only China, generating over 84% of the country's export earnings and employing around 4 million workers, the majority of them women. Now here's the chapter that most Western media barely covered, but it might be the most important part of this entire story. In 2024, something extraordinary happened. A student-led mass uprising swept across Bangladesh with a speed and power that no one predicted. It started as a protest against a government quota system that reserved 30% of civil service jobs for descendants of 1971 Liberation War veterans. A policy young people saw as deeply unfair in a country where merit should matter most. But within days, the protest transformed into something much larger. It became a referendum on 15 years of increasingly authoritarian rule under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. the daughter of Bangladesh's founding father, who had started as a democracy icon but had over time cracked down on opposition, controlled the media, and concentrated power around herself and her party, Gen Z students. The same generation that grew up with smartphones, global awareness, and no memory of the chaos their parents survived, stood their ground even when security forces opened fire. Dozens were killed, hundreds were injured, and still they came back. On August 5th, 2024, Sheikh Hasina resigned and fled the country in a military helicopter, landing in India. It was one of the most dramatic political moments in South Asian history since 1971 itself. And then came the decision that stunned the world. Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the man who invented microfinance, the man who had spent his life giving small loans to the poorest women on earth so they could build something of their own, was asked to lead Bangladesh's interim government. Think about what that means for a moment. A country full of young people who were tired of corruption and broken promises. Chose a Nobel laureate who built his entire career on trusting ordinary people with power. That's not a small political transition. That's a statement about what Bangladesh wants to become. So where does Bangladesh stand in 2026? The honest answer is, in the middle of its most important chapter yet. The economy continues to grow, though the transition period has brought uncertainty that investors are watching carefully. The tech and startup ecosystem is expanding rapidly. Dhaka now has a growing community of young founders building apps, platforms, and solutions for both local and global markets. Bangladeshi freelancers are among the most active in the world on platforms like Upwork and Fiverr, sending billions of dollars back into the domestic economy. A new generation, educated, digitally connected, globally aware, and deeply impatient with the status quo, is stepping forward with an energy that feels genuinely different from anything Bangladesh has seen before. But the challenges are also real and serious. Economic inequality has actually widened even as the overall economy grew. The rising tide lifted some boats much higher than others. Climate change remains an existential threat that no amount of economic growth can fully solve. Political stability is still fragile. Rebuilding trust in democratic institutions after years of erosion takes time, and there are no guarantees. Corruption remains deeply embedded in systems that will take years, maybe decades to reform. And Bangladesh still depends dangerously on a single industry, garments, for the vast majority of its foreign income, which makes it vulnerable to global shifts in trade and automation. These are not small problems. Anyone telling you Bangladesh has figured it all out is selling you something. But here's what is undeniable. A country that was written off, dismissed, mocked, and left for dead before it was even a year old is still writing its story, still standing, still moving, still fighting for something better. So why does any of this matter to you? Sitting here in America, because Bangladesh's story holds up a mirror to something we often forget. We live in a culture obsessed with overnight success, with 10-step plans and life hacks and stories that go from zero to hero in a 90-second reel. But real progress, the kind that actually lasts, doesn't work that way. Real progress is slow, it's painful, it's full of setbacks that would make any reasonable person quit. Bangladesh lost millions of people, survived man-made famines, rebuilt after floods that swallowed entire districts, survived assassination, coups, and decades of broken promises, watched its own leaders, people who were supposed to protect it become the ones it needed protection from. And still, it found a way forward. Not because it was handed anything, not because the world showed up to help, but because ordinary people, farmers, factory workers, teachers, students, mothers refused to accept that their circumstances were their destiny. Your beginning does not determine your ending. Your struggle does not cancel your future. And the world has a deeply dangerous habit of underestimating the people it writes off. Bangladesh was written off. And Bangladesh refused. And maybe, if you look past the geography and the unfamiliar names and the distance, that's the most American story of all, just told from the other side of the world, by people who never stop believing they deserve better. Now, before you go, I have one question for you. Bangladesh was dismissed before it even began, called a lost cause by the most powerful people on Earth, and still it rose. But here's the thing. Bangladesh is not the only country with a story like this. There's another nation out there, a country that survived something arguably even more impossible, a country that went from complete economic collapse and international isolation to becoming a model that the entire world now studies and tries to copy. A country that proved, in just one generation, that a broken system, a broken economy, and a broken identity can all be rebuilt from absolute scratch. I've spent weeks going deep into this story, and I promise you, and when you hear what this country went through and where it is today, your jaw will drop. So if you want to know which country I'm talking about, hit subscribe right now, because next week we're going there. And trust me, you do not want to miss this one.